Thank you for joining me for Common Grounds, a special program where we bring together a Democrat and Republican member of Congress to discuss important issues facing our country and that are being debated in Congress. I'm Evan Jenkins, Senior Vice President, Government Affairs at the U.S. Chamber. Over the last few years, Congress has authorized and appropriated significant investments in infrastructure to improve our economy. Highways, bridges, transit systems, and ports, just to name a few. But it also includes energy production, transmission, and distribution projects to improve energy reliability and efficiency. There's also funding for expanded access to broadband and safe drinking water. What Congress is working on now and what we are going to talk about in this episode of Common Grounds today is the work being done to reform the permitting system that's needed to make these projects a reality. Joining me today, I am honored to welcome Congressman John Curtis and also Congressman Scott Peters. Quick introductions. Congressman Curtis is a Republican out of Utah's 3rd Congressional District. He actually came to Congress after a special election in 2017. He is on the powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee, Vice Chair of Energy, Climate, and Grid Security Subcommittee. He's also on the Natural Resources Committee and a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus. Also is Congressman Scott Peters, who is a Democrat from California's 50th district. If you don't know California and all their districts, he hails from the southern part of the state and has a big chunk of San Diego and the region around San Diego, a beautiful part of California. First elected in 2012, he also serves on Energy and Commerce, but the Budget Committee as well. Ranked the 4th most independent Democrat by the National Journal for his efforts to work across the aisle and try to find bipartisan solutions. He's also a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus. So we've got 2 great members with us today to talk about permitting reform and all this investment in infrastructure. So let's kick it off and really just ask each member of Congress, why do you believe permitting reform is so important to our country? And Congressman Curtis, why don't we start it off with you?
Thank you. Before I even begin, I want to give a shout out to my good friend from San Diego, Scott. Scott, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your work in this area. And Evan, great to be with the Chamber of Commerce. Let me just, in response to your question, say this. I think if you look out a number of years, let's pick the year 2050, every goal that we have, whether it's energy related or climate related, is being blocked by a permitting reform problems. And I don't think we can accomplish any of our goals if we don't deal with permitting reform.
Thank you. Congressman Peters.
So as you mentioned, Evan, first of all, thanks, John. It's nice to see you and to work with you. As you mentioned, we've laid out tremendous amounts of money, which potentially we could invest in infrastructure, in an energy transition to make make our energy more reliable, safer, and cleaner. But that'll never happen if we don't reform our processes, because we have so much to do in so little time, and we don't want that money to sit in the bank. We don't want to waste it on process, and we know what we want to do. So I think from an environmental climate perspective, it's really important for us to push permitting reform. That's not something that comes naturally to Democrats, I must say. But if we're really serious about dealing with these problems, I think it's really necessary.
In my opening comments, I referenced such the magnitude and the scope of the types of infrastructure projects. Often people think of infrastructure as really just the roads and bridges, but we've got a member of Congress from Utah and California, really different type of constituency groups, issues impacting your respective areas that you represent. Why don't you share with me and the folks on this program some of the priority permitting reform efforts that you see needed to address infrastructure action in your respective congressional districts? Congressman Peters, why don't you take this first?
So first of all, I think we should just step back for a second and recognize we've become used to the idea of things taking 2 years to process or 4 years to process. It seems when we're in competition with the rest of the world that that's just not acceptable in any event. But the things you mentioned, broadband, we're trying to build chips, infrastructure, and fabs. All that's going to take time for permitting. We ought to find ways to expedite it. On the environmental side, I think the thing we're starting to talk about more and realize more is that interregional high voltage electricity transmission is going to be really important, because you can build all the wind in Texas and all the solar in Arizona, but if you can't get it to Detroit and Chicago where they need it, you're kind of missing the boat. So I think as Democrats and as climate advocates, we have to recognize that about 95% of the projects in line to be built, energy projects in the country, are clean ones. And so let's build the backbone, and let's build a transmission grid that will support that. And I think all of us in Congress recognize we need a secure grid, one that's reliable, one that provides affordable energy, and one that's cleaner. I think we can all work together on that.
Congressman Curtis.
I'll kind of finish where Scott left off and just double down on this transmission issue as clearly important. A lot of times as Republicans, we're quick to talk about pipelines, but the reality of it is there's a major transmission discussion that needs to be had. And oftentimes we talk about this in terms of clean energy, but Scott mentioned affordable, and I'll also throw in reliable. We need a grid that's clean, affordable, and reliable energy. And then I'll just, you mentioned specifically to my district, let me just highlight, I have a very unique district. About 80% of my geography is mostly federal lands. 90% of that is federal lands managed by one federal agency or another. So imagine something as simple as broadband in an existing right-of-way roadway, trying to permit, taking almost a decade just to permit broadband in an existing roadway through public lands. And you begin to see why we're holding up projects, large and small, broadband, energy, clean, all across the board are all being held up because of this permitting reform.
I appreciate that in the description. Congressman Peters, do you want to make any specific comments about projects in your area that kind of come to mind that maybe with the investment in infrastructure before shovels get in the ground, maybe you've heard from folks saying, permitting is an issue, getting this money to work in our district?
Well, last year, Texas and California both had famous brownouts and energy crises in moments of extreme weather. That's a concern throughout California. To meet this transition challenge, Evan, and to support the investments that we could make out of the IRA, we need to triple the size of the grid in about 30 years. That's 200,000 miles of line every year. And we've been building them at a rate of 1,800 a year, or 18,000 over 10 years. So we have a big leap to make. And the problem is that the average line is taking 10 years to build, but 7 years of that is process. So, and I think all of us agree on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We want a grid that's secure. It has to be upgraded, and it has to be the more grid we put out there, the more competition that there can be that could provide better prices on energy for consumers, which I know is hurting a lot of families and businesses. So we need to get this done, and we're going to have to make some reforms. We started that a little bit with the debt ceiling deal, which had some basic, I thought, reforms for inside the building, for the initial review by the federal government, that we would limit it to 2 years, that we would put certain limitations on the ability to challenge it. I mean, all that made a lot of sense to me. That kind of was obvious, but there's so much more to do. And I think it's going to take a big bipartisan push to get it done. So I think there's a growing recognition among Democrats that we have not done the job by putting all this money in the bank. I think Republicans see some overlapping interests. They've been looking for permit reform for a while. I think it's time for us to come together and make it happen.
Congressman Peters, you've teed up so appropriately kind of the next kind of focus that I wanted to talk about, and that is, yes, you all have made the clear case that the investment has been made. You've indicated projects needing to be permitted in your own districts. And as you say, the debt ceiling limit that was lifted, the legislation, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, some important changes under the NEPA process and others. So give me a sense, and we'll start with you, Congressman Curtis, about the political landscape. What more needs to be done? Is there a sense that even though there were some permitting reforms in the recent FRA legislation, that it was just a start? What do you think the politics and the opportunity for additional permitting reform over the balance of this year looks like?
Well, Evan, and Scott well knows that the political landscape changes from morning to evening. And it's very possible to have an incredibly good bill with strong support that doesn't pass. We see that all the time. Now, that said, let me just say there's a lot of momentum behind permitting reform. It's hard to think of a topic, even with debt ceiling out there, that's talked about more than permitting reform in all circles. And sometimes I worry that that we do have a little bit of problem. People, when they say permitting reform, it means different things to different people. And we've got to make sure that we're all talking about the same issue. But I feel a tremendous momentum and a lot of optimism that we can get something done on permitting reform. As Scott mentioned, we got something done, a good start. But I think we need to do a lot more. And it's very possible, but it's kind of an all hands on deck thing. And everything has to go exactly right in order to actually get the president to sign it.
I mentioned in the opening that both of you are part of this group called the Problem Solvers, and I applaud you for your participation and engagement in that. What I think the vast majority of certainly your constituents and Americans believe that's what we want members of Congress to do, is go solve problems. Would you mind sharing with me within your Problem Solvers caucus how you all are approaching permitting reform and where you see Democrats, Republicans working together to take the next step and build on what has already been able to be achieved?
You tossing that at Scott? I'm going to call Scott out.
Okay. Well, I actually, to be honest, Evan, I think we haven't really engaged the we haven't engaged the problem solvers as much as members of the committee. And John and I and a few other people are really trying to spend some time figuring out what approach would work. I have to give credit to John, by the way, who started the Conservative Climate Caucus. When I came to office, there was a lot of in 2013. There was a lot of pressure among Republicans to deny that climate change was happening altogether. He's got 80 some members who've acknowledged that climate change is happening and that it's driven by human activity. And gosh, that is a profound move toward getting a group of people that we can work with. I do, and I told him this too. I think now we need to see if we can get some legislation out of it. But John's really been a leader in getting the right people at the table in the Problem Solvers Caucus and beyond the Problem Solvers Caucus. We're going to work to find what the scope of this is. And I'll just say too, from a political perspective, Democrats are going to have a hard time supporting more permit reform for pipelines. One of the things that you know about the Keystone Pipeline is that that's a proxy for energy policy. It's really not. Stopping one pipeline is not energy policy, but that's kind of where a lot of Dems are. And frankly, there's already a lot of interstate protection for pipelines under the Natural Gas Act from the 1940s. It is an interstate thing, and I think people understand that states have to stand behind the federal government in getting that system built out, just like they would with the highways. So the political difficulty for us will be adding in that oil and gas side of it, which I know is what's really of most interest to a lot of Republicans, especially folks like John from a place called Carbon County. He didn't mention he represents a county actually named Carbon County. So we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us.
Maybe Evan, if I could just join Scott on that, a couple of comments. Scott's exactly right. The Problem Solvers, I think, deals best when a couple of experts mature a topic and then bring it to Problem Solvers. And I think that's kind of where Problem Solvers is on this. They're waiting for some of us to actually bring them a proposal. But there's a tremendous amount of work with the influencers in energy and climate in Congress on energy and commerce, and others on both Republicans and Democrat side, meeting together and talking a lot about the different issues. And maybe if I can just kind of give a Republican perspective on why oil and gases and pipelines are important to us. And Scott mentioned I represent a county called Carbon County. Many of us represent counties that have been traditional fossil fuel industries. And I want to be really clear, as I represent a fossil fuel county and really a state, that they understand they have to become cleaner, and then eventually no emissions at all. And they're game for that challenge, but they don't want to be ruled out of the game simply because they're a fossil fuel. I think if we can change that paradigm to it's more important, emissions are more important than a specific fuel source, then we can challenge that industry with becoming cleaner. And my experience is they're game for that challenge, and even getting to 2050 with net zero emissions is something they're game for. And so a lot of Republicans will point to that and say, well, we shouldn't be ruling them out. We should be encouraging them and working towards that clean future that they think that they can achieve.
Let me ask you, and you all teed it up, I think, really appropriately, about the voices that need to come to the table. And I appreciate the fact that on the powerful Energy and Commerce Committee that you both serve, percolating ideas, areas of interest, and then hopefully, obviously, the problem solvers' engagement at the appropriate time. Who are some of the voices outside of Congress, groups, organizations, that you think could have an impact on getting the permitting process next steps on track, and how best to engage in the process with members of Congress such as yourself that have already a keen interest to help give you an amplified voice to support this effort? Congressman Peters?
Well, I love that the chamber's involved in this. I think it's great. I think the BRT is interested in it as well. So the business side is really critical for us, and you should all treat yourself like, or act as if you're educators for Congress members about how important this is, and that's great. There are a number of climate groups that are directly involved in transmission that have been really helpful, and they've been really helpful and instructive about where we need to go. We've got academics that are pointing out the case for transmission and for permit reform, all the stuff we have to build, whether it's utility scale solar, wind, offshore wind, hydrogen pipelines, direct air capture. All that stuff needs to happen fast. And there's money for it. There's just a time pressure. So that's been helpful. We're still running up against a lot of skepticism, to be honest with you, with a lot of the traditional environmental groups who have just defended NEPA and some of those laws like they are biblical, like they came from Moses on stone tablets. I've been trying to make the point that those were defense laws that back then in the 1970s, when we were making a lot of mistakes environmentally, it was good to put on the brakes, slow things down, make sure we had considered the effects of things before we built them. And that was the appropriate posture for that time, defense. Now we're on offense as climate activists, and we've got to figure out a way to make this go faster and pick up more yards in the time we have. And so that transition has come a little bit harder to some folks in that community.
I'll just a couple of comments on that. I think responsibility of Republicans is, if not careful, we're branded as just wanting to destroy NEPA and destroy the environmental standards with NEPA. And I think it's incumbent on us to point out and to gain trust that we're not trying to undermine the environmental standards that are put in place with NEPA. We would like to see quicker timelines. We'd like to see more certainty, and bringing to our colleagues and developing trust that's really our goal, and not undermining NEPA, I think is a burden that we've got to work on and make sure that we're articulating well exactly what our goals are. And I might mention, you talk about groups that can be supportive. We need to hear a lot from industry, and I'll give you a couple of examples. Right now, it takes far too long to permit a nuclear plant, and we need the nuclear industry engaged in permitting reform and giving us ideas on how we can shorten that timeline. We really need all facets of industry at the table, pointing out what exactly the impediments are and ideas on how we get past those blockages.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the things we are certainly passionate about and articulated from the outset of this year, and our president, Suzanne Clark, and the State of American Business and an Agenda for America is focused on permitting reform this year. And we have helped form and lead and participating in a coalition of over 350 groups, organizations with a focus on achieving permitting reform. And so to both of your points, bringing voices to the table, coalition of advocates, passionate believers, we are certainly trying to help support that effort through the Permit America to Build coalition and campaign. So we are working Capitol Hill. We appreciate, again, all of your all's incredible support and efforts. Let me ask you, we also know that in Congress, there's a focus on kind of what is called the must-pass pieces of legislation. Standalone bills often have a tough time getting floor time or getting to the president's desk. As we look over the balance of this year, we have Congress dealing with the National Defense Authorization Bill, the federal funding package for the end of September before the new fiscal year, FAA reauthorization, the Farm Bill. I know that there's possibilities in all of those measures where permitting reform can be tacked on, similar to the fact that reform was tacked on to the debt limit bill. What of these must-pass bills do you see as opportunities for permitting reform, and any suggestions on where time, energy, and effort should be focused? Congressman Peters.
Well, I'm going to let the majority speak for what bills are open for amendment, because it's really hard to be in the majority, as you remember, Evan. But I would say this, I think it's a little frustrating to those of us on these great committees that there's not more focus on what the committees do. They're built up exquisitely to solve problems. So we have an Energy and Commerce Committee and an Energy Subcommittee. John and I are both senior members. We're just going to, I think what we do is we just work to figure out what the right answer is, to put in a legislative language, and to be ready to have it passed on the House floor. And then more often than not, as you suggest, it's swept up into some other bill. But we have to do our work to be ready whenever that is. I don't know when that's going to be, but I think there's a real possibility that we can work something into one of these bills. I just would remind everyone that we have to do our work ahead of time, so we have something really good to offer. And we got a little spade work to do before then.
I couldn't agree more with Scott's assessment. The best thing that we can do is be ready for that moment, whether it's a standalone bill or whether it's an opportunity to put it in. And the changes that were made in the debt limit bill didn't just happen. They happened because for months and months and really years before, people were getting ready for that moment. The text was all ready to plug in. And so the work needs to be happening on the ground now by hardworking people on both sides of the aisle, finding that consent, that common ground. The best thing we can do is find that common ground, have the language ready, and then whether it's a standalone bill or an opportunity to place it in, it's ready to go, and it's the right thing. Imagine if the window opens up to put something in and you just throw something in because you have that window and it's not the right thing, or you missed the moment. And so the work needs to be done now.
Well, I would say too, the other thing we learned, Evan, was that to the extent the committee can vet them before they hit that big bill, that's really helpful as well. So John Hickenlooper in the Senate and I had a bill called the Big Wires Act that they were talking about, which would have required each region to provide a minimum amount of out of region capacity and transmission ability to provide more resiliency and more competition. I talked to Garrett Graves, who was helping the speaker on his side. He just said we're uncomfortable putting something in that hasn't been vetted, and I think the committees do a lot of that work. It's hard to slip something at the last minute that hasn't really been worked on and worked over.
with the theme of this being common grounds, last question before we kind of wrap it up. I hear you very clearly that maybe there's areas of opportunity. There are others, aspects of permitting that may be kind of a bridge too far, pardon the pun. Can I query both of you to maybe articulate maybe one or two areas of permitting with what has been achieved thus far, excluding those things that probably can't be achieved? Where might that common ground on permitting reform in whatever vehicle, if well vetted, if groups of folks coalesce around, what aspects of permitting reform might be doable in the balance of the 118th Congress, at least in this calendar year? Congressman Curtis?
Wow, that actually is a really tough one. I will say this, and Scott alluded to it a little bit before, this can't be business as usual. Business as usual takes too long. I would love to see a warp speed permitting reform developed, and I think we could find some common ground about not even changing any rules, but just moving things through quicker, figuring out how to get that bureaucracy to not take 9 years to permit a broadband through a already existing roadway. I think that to the extent that Republicans can be realistic, Democrats can be realistic, there is a lot of common ground ahead for us.
Congressman Peters?
As I've been thinking about this, I think this is the unusual case where you got to make the problem bigger. And there's so many different people who want permit reform for a particular purpose. It almost seems like a bill that takes care of everyone has got the best chance of passing. And it's geothermal, it's mining, it's definitely transmission. I know that there'll be some adjustments requested on oil and gas, which isn't going away in the near future. So I think we have to be open to really trying to put something together that gets broad support because we've dealt with the issue in a really broad way. And if broadband, chips, everything, I think as John and I agree that stuff just can't take this long. And whether or not you agreed with the IRA you're a Democrat or you disagreed with it, just as a taxpayer, you have to be concerned that we're squandering all these resources of time and money on process. And I think it's time to come to grips with that. And I hope that we will. I'm pretty optimistic that we will.
Well, I want to thank you both. Why don't we take 30 seconds or a minute for each of you to provide any kind of final thoughts or comments on this really important issue. Congressman John Curtis, why don't we kick it off with you for any final kind of thoughts or remarks?
So I'm gonna take the challenge from my friend from San Diego. He's talked about our caucus and how we need to move now from an educational caucus to actually promoting and getting things done, and just make my commitment to Scott and others that we need to find a path forward and move forward on this. I can tell you on both the right and left, there are many good men and women anxious to work hard on this issue, to find a path forward. I'll come back to what I started with, that we're not going to reach any of our energy goals, any of our climate goals, any of our environmental goals if we can't overcome the permitting issues that we have here in our country. And I look forward to a bright future and working with my colleagues. And Scott, thank you again for sharing this program with me today.
Fantastic. Congressman Peters, any final thoughts?
I just say I'm lucky to have a partner, John. A lot of folks get a lot of attention in Congress, and they're really more worried about their Instagram accounts and TV appearances than getting stuff done. We've got enough people like John Curtis in the Congress. I think we can make some progress on this, and I think that's our job, and we're looking forward to tackling it and this year.
Well, Congressman Scott Peters, John Curtis, thank you so much for your service to our country, your service to your districts, and your participation in this session of Common Grounds. You've clearly articulated the unique opportunity that we have to address a really important issue. It's not a political issue. It's about our nation's economy. It's moving our country forward. And each of you have articulated and laid out a unique opportunity that we have to see something really particularly impactful happen for our country. To both of you gentlemen, I know you're busy back at home. You are working awfully hard in Washington. Thanks for what you do. Thanks for participating in this session of Common Grounds.